What would you do if the face at your front door was someone you recognized, someone you trusted, someone you had welcomed into your home before, never suspecting that this ordinary moment would be the last calm second of your life? At exactly 2:32 in the afternoon, on a quiet residential street in the village of Bushey, Carol Hunt opened her front door to a young man she knew. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't angry. He stood there calmly, holding what appeared to be her daughter's belongings, like someone stopping by to return a few forgotten things after a breakup. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. No raised voices, no tension, just a familiar figure on a weekday afternoon. And that's exactly why the door opened. What Carol couldn't have known was that this moment had already been replayed countless times in someone else's mind, that the man standing there wasn't looking for closure, but for access. To understand how this ordinary act of kindness became fatal, you have to understand the family behind that door. The Hunts were close, genuinely close. Carol was known in her community as warm and gentle, the kind of person who listened more than she spoke and helped without being asked. Her husband, John Hunt, was a familiar voice to millions as a BBC racing commentator, but at home he was simply a devoted father, deeply connected to his 3 daughters. Louise, the youngest, lived at the family home and ran a successful dog grooming business from a pod in the garden, trusted by clients who valued her calm nature. Her sister Hannah worked in the beauty industry and was described as compassionate and quietly strong. This wasn't a family marked by chaos or conflict. It was built on routine, trust, and the assumption that home was safe, which is what makes what happened next so difficult to process. The man at the door wasn't a stranger. He had been welcomed inside before. He had shared meals at that table. He had been treated as family. His relationship with Louise had ended days earlier, and by all outward appearances, the breakup had been calm. There were no public arguments, no visible warning signs, nothing that would have made Carol hesitate when she saw him standing there. But investigators would later learn that while the relationship had ended, something else hadn't. The story he was telling himself about what that breakup meant. And that quiet internal narrative mattered more than anyone realized. When Carol opened the door, she wasn't welcoming danger. She was acting in line with who she had always been, kind, trusting, compassionate. The doorbell camera would later capture those final moments, her standing there, listening, offering understanding. Seconds later, the illusion of safety would collapse. And as the investigation would reveal, this wasn't a spontaneous act born in that hallway. It was the first step in a plan that had been forming long before the door ever opened. And once that threshold was crossed, nothing inside that house would ever be the same. What if the person you thought had accepted the end of a relationship was quietly rewriting what that ending meant? Because while everyone around Louise Hunt believed a chapter had simply closed, investigators would later argue that 2 very different versions of reality were forming at the same time. On the surface, the breakup appeared clean. Louise had ended the relationship and returned to her routine, her work, her family, her life. Friends would later say she seemed calm and resolved, as though the decision, while difficult, had been final. To her, it was over. But, according to police, that finality didn't land the same way for the man she left. While Louise believed the relationship was behind her, investigators say he remained fixed on it, focused not on separation, but on what he believed had been taken from him. And that gap between those 2 perceptions is where this story begins to darken. In the days after the breakup, nothing outwardly alarming happened. There were no reported threats, no restraining orders, no public confrontations. On the surface, everything appeared normal, but friends would later describe subtle changes in his behavior. withdrawing from social routines, spending long stretches alone, replaying the breakup in conversations that circled the same grievances again and again. None of it seemed dangerous in isolation. That's what made it easy to miss. According to prosecutors, this wasn't chaos or emotional collapse. It was quiet fixation. During this period, investigators say he legally purchased a crossbow. At the time, the purchase itself raised no immediate concern. There was nothing unusual about owning one, and no one around him saw it as a warning sign. But police would later argue that the timing mattered. The purchase came after the breakup, during a period when he had become increasingly isolated and inward-focused. To investigators, it marked a shift from processing loss to preparing for an outcome that went far beyond reconciliation. And here's where the contrast becomes chilling. While Louise was making plans without him, moving forward with her life, police say he was mentally anchored to a version of the relationship that no longer existed. According to the prosecution, his focus narrowed, his thinking becoming increasingly rigid, not explosive, not outwardly aggressive, just controlled, internal, and unresolved. Investigators believe that in this mindset, resentment doesn't announce itself. It just settles in, quietly reshaping how someone interprets blame and entitlement. By the time he returned to the Hunt family home carrying Louise's belongings, police say the visit wasn't about closure. It wasn't about reconciliation. It was about access. And once that access was granted, the collision between those two versions of the breakup, the one Louise believed in and the one he was living inside, would set the stage for everything that followed. What actually happens when the door closes and no one else is there to see it? Because everything that follows depends on a single question investigators would spend months trying to answer. What took place inside the Hunt family home after he was let in? What police know for certain is this: after crossing the threshold, the ordinary rhythms of that afternoon ended. At some point inside the house, Louise Hunt was attacked, her sister Hannah was attacked, and their mother, Carol, was attacked as well. According to investigators, the weapon used was the same crossbow purchased days earlier. What they cannot reconstruct with absolute certainty is the exact sequence of events, only the evidence left behind. Prosecutors would later argue that this was not a sudden, chaotic outburst, but a controlled escalation carried out within the confined space of the home. Evidence suggested movement between rooms, moments where nothing was disturbed, and actions that appeared deliberate rather than panicked. Neighbors reported no screams, no sounds of struggle spilling into the street. Whatever happened, it unfolded quickly, and largely in silence. When emergency responders eventually arrived, they found 3 women inside the house, each fatally wounded. The scene showed violence, but also something investigators found deeply unsettling: signs of order amid chaos. Items had been moved. Certain areas appeared addressed, while others were left untouched. According to police, this suggested the attacker wasn't acting blindly, but following a sequence he had already imagined. Investigators believe he remained inside the house for a period of time after the attacks. During that window, evidence shows he changed clothing and moved through the space before leaving. Those minutes would later become central to the prosecution's argument that what happened was not impulsive, but intentional. One of the most disturbing developments came not from the crime scene, but from what happened afterward. According to investigators, the suspect contacted someone he had grown close to after the breakup, an affair partner he had been confiding in during the weeks leading up to that day. In recorded calls later turned over to police, he spoke about what had happened in a disturbingly casual tone. He referenced injuries. He explained visible marks on his body as the result of an incident, minimizing the scale of what had just occurred. As the conversation continued, prosecutors say the person on the other end began to realize this wasn't exaggeration or fantasy. It was a confession. Details surfaced that couldn't be brushed off. Confusion gave way to fear. And while the bodies inside the Hunt home would soon be discovered, much of what happened in those moments after the attacks would only ever be known through evidence, inference, and those recorded calls. As detectives began to assemble the timeline, one conclusion became unavoidable. Whatever unfolded inside that house was not improvised. It followed a path investigators believe had been forming long before the door ever opened. What would you do if someone spoke about killing a family as if they were describing a problem already finished? Because for investigators, the case shifted not through spectacle or discovery, but through language. In the days following the attack, while the Hunt family home remained sealed and the investigation intensified, the suspect continued communicating with someone he had grown emotionally close to after the breakup. According to police, those conversations quickly took on a disturbing tone. What began as fragmented explanations turned into something far more revealing. And crucially, they were being recorded. Investigators would later learn that the affair partner, increasingly unsettled by the details and delivery, made the decision to document the calls. In those recordings, prosecutors say, the suspect spoke about the events in the past tense, before authorities had officially confirmed what had happened inside the house. He referred to injuries, outcomes, and people as if their fate had already been settled. According to transcripts later reviewed by investigators, there was little emotion in his voice, no confusion, no disbelief, just explanation. That emotional flatness immediately stood out. As detectives listened, they began testing what they heard against what they were uncovering independently. Timelines were checked. Locations mentioned were compared to movement data. Phone records placed the suspect near the Hunt home at critical moments. GPS data traced his movements before and after the attack. Purchases made in the days surrounding the incident took on new significance when viewed alongside the calls. Most unsettling of all was his language, speaking about members of the family as if they were already gone, even while the investigation was still unfolding. Investigators would later describe that choice of words as deeply concerning. To them, it suggested not confusion or shock, but finality. As the recordings continued, prosecutors say the person on the other end began to understand the gravity of what they were hearing. According to police, the realization wasn't dramatic, it was practical. Remaining silent could make them complicit. That's when the recordings were handed over, giving investigators a rare, unfiltered look into the suspect's mindset after the attack. With that evidence in hand, authorities moved carefully. Every statement was corroborated against forensic findings, digital records, and physical evidence recovered from the scene. Nothing stood alone. And when the arrest finally came, it wasn't sudden. It was the result of details stacking until denial was no longer possible. The suspect was taken into custody without incident and formally charged in connection with the deaths of Carol, Louise, and Hannah Hunt. Yet, even with an arrest made, investigators were left facing a reality that refused to settle. One crucial question still had no answer, not about who did this, but about what remained hidden. And until that truth surfaced, the case was far from complete. How far would parents go to protect their child, especially when that child is accused of doing the unthinkable? Because as investigators pressed forward, the case began to widen in a way few initially expected. What first appeared to be the actions of a single individual no longer stood alone. According to police, the timeline after the killings raised new questions that didn't stop with the suspect, but extended to who arrived after everything had already gone wrong. In the days following the deaths of Carol, Louise, and Hannah Hunt, detectives began looking closely at who had access to the home, who had knowledge of what occurred inside it, and who may have taken actions after the fact. That's when attention shifted to the suspect's parents. According to court filings, they traveled to the Hunt family home shortly after the attacks. At first glance, that could be explained as shock or concern, but investigators would later say the amount of time they spent inside the house mattered. By the time detectives reviewed phone data, purchase records, and interview transcripts, the explanation began to feel incomplete. One detail stood out almost immediately: a replacement mattress. According to police, a new mattress was purchased and delivered to the home shortly after the killings. On its own, that might sound ordinary. In context, it wasn't. For investigators, the question wasn't just why, it was when. Why replace a bedroom item so quickly in a home that had already become the center of a homicide investigation? As detectives continued digging, other details surfaced. During a follow-up interview, one of the parents made a brief verbal slip referencing a fact that had not yet been made public. It was subtle, but it caught investigators' attention. Around the same time, digital evidence began telling its own story. Phone records suggested coordination between family members. Location data showed movement patterns that conflicted with earlier statements. And then there was the weapon. Investigators would later say that crossbow bolts and related equipment were recovered not where the suspect claimed they had been discarded, but in a location connected to family access. Each detail, viewed in isolation, might have had an innocent explanation. Together, prosecutors would argue they suggested actions taken after the killings that may have interfered with the investigation. Eventually, arrests followed. The suspect's parents were taken into custody and charged with offenses related to assisting an offender and obstructing justice. The case had officially grown beyond a single defendant. Yet, even as the legal scope expanded, one reality remained unchanged. The Hunt family's loved ones, their friends, their community, were still left without answers that bring any sense of peace. No recovery, no finality, just absence. And as the case moved toward trial, investigators made it clear that while they believed they knew who was responsible, one question still loomed larger than all the rest. Why this path was chosen at all? Why choose violence when there were other ways out? By the time this case reached its final phase in court, investigators believed the central questions had shifted. It was no longer just about what happened, or even who was responsible. According to prosecutors, the evidence had already spoken to that. What remained was harder to explain, and far more unsettling. Why did this end the way it did? The prosecution argued that the motive was not sudden rage or emotional collapse. It was something quieter and more deliberate. The breakup, they said, represented more than rejection. It threatened a version of life the suspect believed he was entitled to keep, a future where he remained in control, respected and unchanged. Divorce, separation, the loss of identity he had built around the relationship, those were outcomes he could not accept. And in that mindset, investigators argued, preserving control mattered more than consequence. In court filings, prosecutors laid out a theory built not on emotion, but on preparation. The timing of the weapon purchase, the deliberate return to the Hunt family home, the absence of panic afterward, the recorded conversations, the steps taken to manage what others would see. Taken together, they argued, these were not the actions of someone who lost control, but of someone who made a decision. Financial considerations were addressed carefully. Prosecutors noted that the suspect faced not just emotional loss, but the collapse of a future he believed defined his status and direction. But they were clear. This case wasn't about money alone. It was about avoiding a reality where he no longer held power over the narrative of his own life. As the case moved through the courts, the human cost remained impossible to reduce to legal terms. Carol, Louise, and Hannah Hunt became names attached to evidence, timelines, and exhibits. But outside the courtroom, they were remembered in quieter ways: empty seats at family gatherings, clients who never returned, routines that simply stopped. A home once associated with safety became a permanent marker of absence. For those left behind, their extended family, friends, and community, no verdict could restore what was lost. And even as the legal process moved forward, investigators acknowledged a difficult truth. Some questions may never have answers that feel satisfying. Motive can be argued, but never fully measured. Intention can be inferred, but never undone. This story, at its core, is not just about a crime. It's about how familiarity can become a vulnerability, how calm can conceal intention, and how the most dangerous moment is sometimes the one that looks ordinary until it isn't. Long after the court proceedings conclude and the attention fades, that discomfort remains. Not as a warning sign easily spotted, but as a question that lingers quietly, about trust, about hindsight, and about the moments we only understand once they're already gone. What happens after the headlines fade? When the cameras leave, the court filings stop circulating, and the story everyone thinks they understand quietly keeps going. Because while this case moved through the legal system, its impact did not pause. It settled into ordinary lives, reshaping them in ways that were subtle, permanent, and impossible to measure on a timeline. In the weeks that followed, the village of Bushey changed. Not dramatically, not visibly, but perceptibly. Neighbors described streets that felt quieter, not because fewer people lived there, but because a sense of ease had vanished. Front doors stayed closed longer. Conversations lowered when the house was mentioned. Familiar routines, dog walks, brief chats over garden fences, carried a hesitation that hadn't been there before. Grief, for those closest to the Hunt family, didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments: disbelief, exhaustion, anger, and then long stretches of silence. Tributes appeared: flowers, notes, messages from strangers who had never met Carol, Louise, or Hannah, but felt compelled to acknowledge their loss. John Hunt's absence from BBC broadcasts was noted quietly. Colleagues spoke carefully, aware that public sympathy could never touch what was private. Friends would later say the hardest part wasn't the attention. It was what came after, when support thinned and reality took its place. Even investigators carried the weight of the case with them. Officers involved would later describe it as one that lingered, but about how often danger only becomes visible once it's already part of the aftermath. There were no dramatic warnings, no clear moment where intervention would have felt obvious. That uncertainty stayed with them, forcing reflection on how violence can grow unnoticed when it hides behind familiarity. Public conversation began to shift. The focus moved away from spectacle and toward warning signs that don't look like danger at first: fixation, entitlement, the inability to accept loss. Advocates emphasize that not every threat announces itself. Some arrive calmly, carrying belongings, asking for one last conversation. For those who knew the Hunts, memory became both comfort and weight. Carol's warmth, Louise's dedication, Hannah's quiet strength, not as symbols, but as individuals whose absence left specific, irreplaceable gaps. Birthdays passed, anniversaries came and went. Life continued in form, but not in feeling. And perhaps the most difficult legacy of this case is how easily its earliest moments could have been dismissed as harmless. No chaos, no confrontation, just familiarity. Which leaves a question that lingers long after the case itself concludes. not about guilt or verdicts.
So, if you liked the story and want to hear more stories like that, then hit the subscribe button and like the video. See you in another video with another story. Till then, peace out.